Hello whisky fans. Today's video might put some of you off, and that's fine. Today's review is a very humble and very affordable little whisky, and is a blended Scotch whisky. Now if you're a long-term viewer of mine, you'll know that doesn't necessarily put me off. Blended whisky and grain whisky and blended malt whisky, they're all very underrated but very important categories of whisky, and in my opinion they all have the potential to be manufactured to the same exacting high standards that we expect from single malt. Another reason why I've decided to do this video is that I think that we do need to have more recognition and talk more about affordable whisky. Not every whisky needs to be the roller coaster of flavours that you get from a premium single malt Scotch. There is a definite and justified position in the Scotch whisky world for something with a bit more subtlety and something a little bit more refined and light. We also need to remember that not everyone out there wants to pay the big bucks for the best of the best with every bottle. Not everyone out there is in a position where that's even an option to do. In my opinion, I think that with whisky and with a lot of things, simply being decent quality and affordable is a perfectly valid and justified option that really shouldn't be looked down upon as much as it is. Especially when you consider that a lot of these whiskies, they're not just good everyday drams, but they might be a lot of people's gateway whiskies, or at least a stepping stone towards their gateway whisky. And perhaps most relevant of all in today's climate is that by buying these more reasonably priced quality drams, you're not encouraging the hype and hysteria and outright price gouging, because that's what it is, that you get with a lot of modern whisky. So saying that, here's a whisky that's not only regularly on the top 10 list of best-selling whiskies here in the UK, but it's also a bottle that you can pick up, a full 70 centilitre bottle, for just over a tenner. This is Bell's Original. So I did say that you can get a full bottle of this for just over a tenner, and that's absolutely the case. Bell's is a brand that I was super familiar with all through my life, especially growing up. When you go into a pub or when you see other people, family members and such, buying whisky, Bell's, Famous Grouse, Grant's, and perhaps slightly more recently Johnny Walker has made more of a presence again here in the UK. But Bell's is something that in the UK I think everyone's going to be familiar with, whether you're a whisky drinker or not. I have actually read that Bell's as a brand is not so present outside of the UK. It, according to what I've read, it seems that it might be more of a UK and South African, and to a lesser extent the Scandinavian market, where we have this stuff available all the time. So if you don't live in one of those markets, there's a chance that you possibly haven't seen this one, or it's not available to you as it is to us here. But for us Brits, this is an absolute whisky staple, and me personally, I've always kind of liked Bell's. I think that it's one of the better basic cheap blends that are around, and it's also been around for a really long time. Bell's as a brand has been around for about 200 years, and right from the start, Arthur Bell, the founder of the company, made a point of using whisky that was a little bit more mature than what was on offer from a lot of his contemporaries. In 1933, as happens with a lot of the histories of the big blending companies, Bell's actually bought the Blair Athol and Dufftown distilleries, with Blair Athol in particular as one of the key components that go into the Bell's blend. Very similar to the way that if you look at the history of Johnny Walker, Cardew Distillery was, I think, the first distillery that was purchased by Johnny Walker. Speaking of Diageo, Bell's was actually purchased by Guinness quite a few years ago, and a lot of you will know that Guinness merged with Grand Metropolitan and formed Diageo. So Bell's is actually a Diageo product now, and several other Diageo malts are used in the Bell's blend. Now, in my opinion, when it comes to blended Scotch whisky, I think you really need to go one of two ways. You either need to go full craft premium blended Scotch, which is obviously going to sell for a reasonably high price, or you need to go the complete opposite way and go for something that's an economy production led by some quality young grain whisky, good quality grain whisky to make something that's light and smooth in character and profile, but still enjoyable. I think that when you stray into the middle ground between those two extremes, a lot of blends, and probably the majority of blends that are available to us not even now, you start to get problems, because when you take a cheap production and make it premium, or a premium production and try and save costs, you end up putting some cheap malt whisky in there, and the larger presence of that malt whisky can make itself more known, and you start to see more of the flaws from that cheap economy malt whisky. In particular, you start to get more of the youth and the harshness, and a lot of those immature young flavours from that poorly matured malt whisky will start to clash. And on the other end of the problem, when you start to have too high a grain content in a whisky that does have a fair amount of malt or some fairly bold malts, the grain whisky starts to cover things up, make things a little bit muddy. And when you have these malt whiskies which may be added with good intentions, but with a slightly cheaper production with a higher grain content, you can start to lose focus and lose some of the features and flavours that those malt whiskies are trying to add. So with our Bell's Original, this is actually a half bottle. This is obviously the latter of the two examples I just talked about. You can get a full bottle of this for about £13. This one here I paid under a tenner, so it's definitely on the cheaper end of even blended Scotch whisky. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be bad. I do kind of think that we definitely need to revise the way that we think of blended malt and blended Scotch and grain whiskies. Here in the UK and worldwide and online, there's a lot of snobbery, and I think that it kind of creates a self-perpetuating cycle where everyone doesn't expect much of blended whisky, and that means that the price that they can offer it for is restricted, which means that the productions that we get tend to be quite limited, which just reinforces people to think that blended whisky is not worth buying. But in particular, cheap, youthful, but well-made, grain-driven blended Scotch whisky, I feel that it should really be in a category of its own. I think if you regard things like this as a grain whisky that's been top-dressed by a little bit of single malt, you're probably more likely to have a more positive experience with it. What I do think is really unhelpful though, and we're all guilty of this, is we do need to stop comparing blended Scotch to single malt. We need to stop this thought process where we think of grain whisky and blended Scotch and blended malt as being better or worse. Generally, we think of it as worse than single malt. I think that it's a little bit disingenuous and it's not particularly helpful, in the same way as you wouldn't compare something like a really good Pilsner or a Bordeaux wine to a single malt. One final word of advice before we get some of this in the glass though, is really don't do an A-B comparison of something like this to your favourite single malt, because things like this are perfectly enjoyable in their own little microcosm. But if you do decide to do an A-B comparison of something like this against a single malt, it's 40% and probably 3 years and a day old. It's going to highlight that it is very, very light and subtle. It's going to bring out the immaturity, which perhaps isn't that noticeable if you drink it on its own. So anyone that does decide to do A-B comparisons of cheap grain-led blended Scotch whisky or a single grain against single malts, you kind of get what you've asked for. Anyway, let's get some in the glass and let's see what we've got. So, presentation of this one. Is it natural colour? Is it chill filtered? Does it have an age statement? Those aren't serious questions. As I was saying that, the colour of that one, there's almost certainly is caramel colouring in this one, but not too bad. We're not in White and Mackay country. It's not like the colour of a heavily sherried whisky like some of these blended Scotches are. So on the nose of Bell's Original, which is their no age statement product, 40% ABV if anyone didn't guess, you can immediately tell that this is a very, very heavily grain-driven whisky. It almost smells like a slightly caramelly, slightly more feature-filled grain whisky. And the first thing that you notice is that there's a strong note of caramel and coconut. So that's probably coming from a combination of some slightly less active casks, but not dead casks. There's no bitterness, no cardboardiness with this one, not the sort of notes that you get from a grain whisky that's been matured in a completely dead cask. You can tell that they've taken a little bit of pride in the production of this. Also getting some rather sweet vanilla custard notes, some starchy grains. Tiny hint of sherry in there. And a tiny hint of sort of a dry, grassy, slightly interesting sort of profile single malt character. There's a very light appliness in there. Is it immature? There's a note of youth in there, but I wouldn't say that it's immature to the point where it's a problem. This is a young whisky, and you really need to assess it for what it is. So, Bell's Original on the palate. So, on the palate, there is a thinness to this whisky, but I think with the profile that they've chosen and the fact that it's so grain-led, the fact that it's a little bit light doesn't affect this in such a detrimental way as it does on something like the Lagavulin 16 being at 43%. I think because it's a gentle, light, sweet, refined profile, the fact that it's not the most powerful whisky doesn't affect it that much. On the palate I'm getting lots of sweet diluted caramel, sugary vanilla and coconut grain notes, similar to what I had on the nose. Again, there's a hint of youth, but nothing too bad. It's not a harsh, immature, unpleasant whisky. What it is very refined and a little bit mild. But all in all, it's a pleasant experience, and it's a whisky that, if it's all you had, or you just fancied a change, it's an enjoyable whisky. As for the finish, we are talking about roughly £10 for a bottle, 40% widely available blend. The finish is pretty short, kind of about as short as you can get. But again, it's a pleasant finish, very short but very light and sweet, a little bit sugary and quite refined. I think that to expect a long or even a medium length finish on something that sells for about £10 a bottle and is so grain-led and bottled at 40%, it's really asking a little bit too much. I think the fact that it has so little immaturity and it is smooth and light and sweet and pleasant is about as much as you can ask for. Something that I do keep finding myself drawn back to thinking when I'm tasting this whisky and whiskies like this is kind of the history of whisky in the UK, and which is an incredibly interesting topic. And probably some of you all know that there was actually a time in the UK where it was actually illegal to mix single malt and grain whiskies. Now, when Parliament finally relented and allowed products to be sold that mixed single malt and grain whisky here in the UK, it led to a massive upsurge in sales for whisky, because suddenly it made all of these whiskies available that could be made economically and easily and quickly, that had some flavours from the single malts, but they were light and refined and gentle, and that's exactly what a lot of people wanted. A lot of people back then may not have been whiskey drinkers, maybe they were beer or wine drinkers, and they didn't want something as harsh as a single malt. And when I drink this whisky, I can see a lot of those people, I can see what they liked in the blended Scotch category, because you've got that lovely, sweet, refined profile from the grain whiskies, and it's like it's just been top-dressed with some interesting character, a little bit of sherry, a little bit of malted barley character, just to give it a little bit of interest. I think if you're going to compare this whisky to anything, I'd say that it's a reasonably similar experience to the Kenmore blended Scotch that you can buy from M&S here in the UK. And that's really a category that I like. If you're going to go cheap, I always recommend, like really, really cheap, I'd always recommend that you go for a grain-heavy blended Scotch rather than something that tries to be above its station. And the Ballantine's No Age Statement blend falls into that category as well. They're all excellent, economical, grain-driven, light and refined alternatives to proper single malt whisky, and I think they all offer a much improved price to quality ratio than 99% of the more expensive blended Scotch offerings. And I'm also not just singing the praises of cheap whisky here, because there is an abundance of horrible cheap whisky out there, especially when you look at some of the grain whisky that goes into some of the competitor products to the Bell's original. Cheap, young grain whisky that's been dumped for 3 years into a completely dead cask can have horrendous acetone, really spirity, harsh, sort of nail varnish, paint stripper notes, and it can be really unpleasant. But what you've got here, I think it is a cheap product, but it's without that harshness that you get in things like Famous Grouse or White and Mackay or the single grain offerings that we're getting from Hague now. Something else that I've got to do, that I've got to look at, because it's just an interesting thing that all whisky geeks have on their mind. When you're tasting a mystery malt or a blended Scotch whisky, you've got to try and decipher what can you taste in there in terms of the single malt that's gone into this. So historically, Blair Athol Distillery, which is available, reasonably widely available as the Flora and Fauna bottling, a 43% 12-year-old, that has historically been tied really strongly with the Bell's blended whisky range. And I think there is some evidence of that Blair Athol DNA in this Bell's blend. You've got some slightly cakey notes, a little bit of grassiness, and there's a little bit of a sweetened tea quality to it. But comparing this one directly to the Blair Athol 10-year-old from the Flora and Fauna range, which I said that you shouldn't do because it doesn't highlight the flaws, but it highlights what's missing in the grain whisky style of whisky. But when you do compare them, I think that the single malts that go into this, it's, to me, quite evident that there's probably quite a few other single malts going into this. In particular, being a Diageo product, thinking possibly Cragganmore gone into this. But whatever they have put in here, and we don't know, and they're unlikely to tell us, I think that they've done a really good job of top dressing this really nice little grain whisky with some really interesting little notes from some various single malts. As for a grade, I'm going to give this one a C, which, in my opinion, for such a cheap blended Scotch, is a really good grade. You do have to remember that I'm assessing this essentially as a grain whisky, or at least as a blended Scotch. But I think that to be bang in the middle of what I would call good, not outstanding, not terrible, is a pretty good result. One other thing that I do need to talk about with this whisky, and it's something that I glossed over very quickly at the start because I don't think that it's that relevant, is the ABV. Because anyone that's watched a few of my videos will know that I complain about the ABV of pretty much everything that's below 46%, and I personally think that I'm completely justified in doing so, because the vast majority of single malts that you can get now, and the majority of what you got in the past, when you bottle it below 46%, it doesn't do justice to the single malt style. Whereas this whisky, I actually think that it doesn't matter as much. In fact, I'm not even sure if it would even improve the experience of drinking this whisky if it was at 43 or 46%. I actually think with that light, refined, grain-driven profile, I think that a slight lack of power, because it has got a slight lack of power, isn't particularly noticeable or relevant to your enjoyment of this whisky. Another little bonus feature about this whisky, and part of the reason why I didn't go for the full bottle, is that the bottles that you get, these half bottles of Bell's in, the size and shape of them makes for a really good hip flask. A little bit more dangerous than your traditional tin pewter or steel or whatever hip flask, but the size and shape of that, I'll definitely be keeping that one, because being made out of glass, it's going to be almost completely inert, and it's a really handy little size and shape for slipping into a pocket on a long walk on a cold winter's day. So really interested to hear what you guys have to say on this one. What do you think of blended Scotch? What do you think of cheap blended Scotch? And what do you think of the grain heavy whiskies like the Bell's Original? I know a lot of people are just going to say, it's not for me, it's not good enough, it's not mature enough, tastes like nail varnish remover, which is fair. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But me personally, I think that it definitely deserves to be its own category of whisky. And I think that it's a category of whisky that we could do so much more with if we just dropped the snobbery. Thanks for watching. I look forward to hearing from you, and cheers.